Set in 1950 Jim Crow-era Florida, the Reformatory tells the story of 12-year-old Robert Stevens, who is sent to a brutal reformatory with a harrowing reputation, and that of his older sister Gloria, who fights against the torrential injustices of her age, skin color, and gender as she fights her social and legal battles to free Robbie from the Gracetown School for Boys, and hopefully deliver him from the clutches of death. The Reformatory is a very heavy book. I do not think I smiled once the whole time I was reading it, but it is a very well-crafted book with a poignant message that I wish was not as necessary and relevant as it is. For those of you who are unfamiliar, here's a brief history of the Jim Crow South for you. Signs that say no colored people, separate schools and drinking fountains. Jim Crow laws mandated segregation in schools, parks, public transit, and myriad other public spaces. It made it difficult, if not outright impossible, for black people to vote through bullshit like literacy tests. Interracial marriage is illegal. Property owners were allowed to sign agreements that barred black people from buying homes in certain neighborhoods. And this bullshit carried on from the late 1800s all the way up to the 1960s. Not a nice place for people of color. The Reformatory has two basic stories that it's working with. The first one is Gloria, a young, poor, black woman in the South who has a brother in a reform school and a father in Chicago. And unfortunately, her mother recently passed away. And as she fights to get Robbie's conviction overturned, she is met with derision, doubt, and all kinds of other needless bureaucratic nonsense, despite coming up with money and legal support for Robbie. A white man said Robbie needs to go to Gracetown, so Gracetown is where Robbie will go. And this is one of the most well-rendered struggles of the Jim Crow era that I have encountered in fiction. It's compelling, it's heart-wrenching, it's enthralling. It made me feel bad. But I think that's good. The other story is that of Robbie's incarceration, where Robbie is confronted with the ghosts of the Gracetown School for Boys and its vile warden. Literally, Robbie can see ghosts. That seems like a spoiler, but I promise it's not really. Gracetown is another segregated area, so Robbie makes friends with two other colored boys, Redbone and Blue. And Robbie, with help from his two new friends, learned that boys going missing from Gracetown ain't even the half of it. And before long, Robbie enters into a fight for his life. As Robbie is in a predominantly male environment, with the exception of a nurse and his band teacher, Robbie's struggles focus less on the social injustice of the era, and more on the physical, mental, and emotional abuse heaped on the boys that were sent to these institutions, as well as the lengths that these schools and caretakers will go to avoid detection and government oversight. Not that anyone was overly concerned anyways. When I was first introduced to the Reformatory, it was sold to me as a horror story. I suppose that that's true. I did not really find it scary at all, but it is exceedingly grim with a number of spooky things that occur throughout. It deals a lot with horror elements, but I think it failed to deliver on being scary, and succeeds more as a sad, brutal ghost story with some action and thriller suspense elements. Maybe that's horror for you. My only other real criticism with this book is I think it was too long. There were some sections that felt like filler or that we were rehashing points that were made earlier in the story. And at nearly 600 sad, grim pages, I would prefer to not be meandering about or revisiting things. Let's cut about 100 pages off of this and then we'll really be cooking. There were a handful of characters who I thought were pretty thinly drawn, which, when contrasted with the majority of our main cast who were very fully realized, those interactions tended to fall a little flat and feel a bit stilted. Overall, this is a heavy, wonderful, deeply emotional, but educational book. It's a good time if you're looking for a bad time, so to speak. I highly recommend The Reformatory if you're interested in horror with a message, rather than blood for blood's sake. I like blood, but whatever. I give The Reformatory 4 out of 5 hammers.